Hello, everyone. My name is Ron Kneebone, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. My camera's not working, so you just have to look at my name. I'm the Scientific Director of Social Policy and Health Research at the School of Public Policy. Thank you for joining us. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school, known for our practical and focused policy research. We're pleased to share our expertise on relevant and timely issues through this webinar series. I'm happy to have Anna Cameron and Gillian Petit from the School of Public Policy here to discuss the idea of providing a basic income. Jillian and Anna will make a short presentation, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. This seminar is being recorded, so if you have to leave early, please check your website or our website or our YouTube channel for a copy. With that said, Jillian and Anna, I'm turning it over to you.
We're on? Okay, great. Thanks, Ron. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. What we're hoping to do today is have a bit of a more nuanced discussion about not only the effectiveness of a crisis basic income today, but also the viability of basic income and basic income approaches post-crisis. So we'll kick things off with just a brief presentation. And in this presentation, we really want to do three things. So one, we want to provide some background on basic income, outline for you some of the discourse surrounding it in the context of the pandemic. Two, we want to use some realistic scenarios to highlight different types and extent of need, and then use these scenarios to lay out a few reasons why we think the basic income approach is perhaps a misguided one for responding to the current crisis. And then three, we want to offer some things to think about in terms of getting from where we are now to thinking about adopting basic income approaches or basic income philosophies in the future. So I'll start by saying that our research team, and Jillian here in particular, has for a while now been focused on understanding this complex web of programs and supports that is our social safety net. So we've also been looking at how it can be improved to solve some of its peskier issues. So these are issues of access, they're issues of adequacy, among other things like baked in work disincentives. And we've been evaluating the merits of basic income and basic income approaches as part of this process. So it's really this work that leads us to question the suitability of a crisis basic income in the context of delivering support during a pandemic. So what is a basic income? Well, it's called by many names, takes just as many forms, is touted for a variety of reasons, from wresting income support provision from the administrative labyrinths of our bureaucracies to offering some path forward in the context of the future of work and automation, and in a general sense, the cash transfer. So it's often paid to the individual, though that is a design consideration. And it's premised on the philosophy of ensuring everyone has an income that's sufficient to meet their basic needs, regardless of their life circumstance, and that includes their work situation. So it's about offering people adequate financial support and security in a dignified way. That is in a way that the current income support system doesn't always do. So as the pandemic and the isolation measures sort of drag on, we're seeing more and more people, whether it's advocates or economists, politicians, or the broader population, really raise this idea of basic income or crisis basic income as the way forward, both through the pandemic and also in recovery now. So to date, we know the federal government has taken a different approach. So instead of introducing a crisis basic income, they've drawn on their existing program infrastructure. So they've expanded bits of EI, they've delivered enhancements to the Canada Child Benefit, they've boosted one time the GST credit, and then they've introduced additional targeted measures to sort of fill in the gaps. And these measures all have particular policy goals. So this includes the CERB. We know that's for people who've lost employment or income as a result of COVID-19. There's also the CESB to support those in post-secondary who aren't qualifying for the CERB, 75% wage subsidy to employers, and then an injection of funding to nonprofits, for example, delivering essential services, some specific supports for vulnerable populations. And as these programs have been unveiled and tweaked and enhanced, and I should say in quite a responsive way by the federal government, some have argued that a basic income would actually be a better solution than sort of this patchwork of policies that the federal government has implemented. So some have suggested a targeted basic income, that is one that would be paid to individuals who fall below a certain income threshold. Others are suggesting that now is the time for permanent basic income. And then one proposal that seems to have gotten a lot of airtime is this idea of a crisis basic income. So that would be $2,000 paid immediately, automatically to all Canadians who filed income tax last year. And at first glance, this sounds like a great idea, super easy and quick, but there are some key things that we know, both about poverty and levels of need, as well as benefit delivery itself, that sort of make us question whether this is in fact the right approach in a crisis. So now I'm going to pass it over to Jillian so she can speak a bit more to why we think that's the case.
All right, hi everyone. So there's a couple of reasons why we think right now isn't the right time for a basic income. And the first reason is because a basic income can't address heterogeneity of need. So it can't address different types and different levels of need. So I'll give you a bit of a scenario here. So first off, a $2,000 basic income would go to, first off, people that don't need it. So I think of my situation here, you know, during the pandemic, I haven't lost employment and my costs have been reduced. So in the long run, I'll probably be better off. And although $2,000 basic income would be great, it's really, you know, it would be great to have money, I don't need it. So that $2,000 that goes to people like me could be better used elsewhere. Secondly, again, you know, let's go with a scenario and think of people who don't have income, right? So think about someone in post-secondary, say a 19-year-old who was unable to secure summer employment and they're living at their parents' house and, you know, they don't necessarily pay, you know, top of the line rent and maybe they're not even paying for their food, but their income's zero. If we implemented a basic income, this person would get $2,000 say, because they have zero income. Let's compare that person, that post-secondary student, to another post-secondary student who maybe also didn't secure summer employment, but before the pandemic was couch surfing. Now, because of the pandemic, they're not able to couch surf anymore. So they've been living rough. They've been living out on the streets, or they've been living in these socially distant shelters. They would also get a $2,000 basic income, but both our rough liver and our and our person living with the parents, although they both appear to have zero income, they're not both living in poverty and they both have different levels of need. A person being supported by the parents, they might need you know, money to help them pay tuition in the fall, and this can be addressed through things like the Canada Student Benefits or student grants or the CESB. Whereas a student that's living rough, they need more targeted supports and they need more support generally. They need housing, they need housing supports. So a better targeted program would look at potentially providing housing or providing some type of income supplement for their housing. And a basic income of $2,000 to both these people might be equal, but it's not necessarily equitable. The other problem with the basic income is it doesn't reach everybody, right? So most advocates of a basic income have suggested that it be paid through our tax delivery system, so by the CRA. The CRA would be able to pay a basic income to tax filers. The problem with this is that a lot of people don't file their taxes. So in Alberta, 15% of adults in Alberta don't file their taxes. This is even more prevalent for low-income persons. So we know that 1 in 3 income assistance recipients do not file their taxes, and that roughly 40% of First Nations persons with children don't qualify for the Canada Child Benefit. So they're not filing their taxes. If a basic income is meant to go to people who need it most, how are we going to get it to these people who aren't tax filers, right? How do you reach non-filers? How do you reach people who don't have fixed addresses, right? So a basic income, although it seems simple and elegant, it doesn't reach all vulnerable persons. It doesn't reach all persons in need necessarily, and it's not a great tool to target different levels and different types of need.
So we're now in a moment of crisis management, and that's really requiring us to act quickly and in a way that's sensitive to these differing levels of need that Jillian has highlighted. And to do so, we're largely getting by using existing policy tools. And by contrast, we know that basic income is truly a systemic overhaul. And if we're going to pursue it or pursue basic income approaches, we need to do it meticulously. We need to construct it meticulously and implement it meticulously in order to get it right. And there are many things to figure out in terms of design, in terms of policy intent, its interaction with existing programs and supports. But this complexity and challenge, I don't think by no means suggests that the conversation should be abandoned. In reality, COVID-19 has laid bare the gaps and inadequacies in our systems. It's exposed many of us to fissures and complexities and administrative nightmares. Maybe we didn't know existed before, but which some Canadians are forced to navigate, even in times of relative stability and prosperity. We've also seen that the impacts of the pandemic have not been indiscriminate. They've not been evenly distributed. So we've really seen the vulnerability of younger people, those in low-wage work, those in unsafe jobs, people in the gig economy, and a large proportion of women and immigrants. Truly, their vulnerability has been exposed by the crisis. And so many aspects and principles of a basic income do respond directly to some of these issues I've highlighted. And they could figure prominently in plans to address these issues. So basic income as a philosophy of support should be a part of our conversation going forward as we look to build a better system and a better future for more people. But as we proceed, it's really, really vital to note that adopting basic income and even basic income approaches without some key changes to the current system risk carrying with it and actually perpetuating many of the issues we're faced with now. So it's our thought that we need to get a few other things right first, and we think a good first step would be to ensure automatic tax filing, particularly for the most vulnerable, so those receiving social assistance. So Jillian's going to speak a bit more to that as a policy proposal.
Right, so the basic idea behind automatic tax filing is that the CRA would pre-populate our tax forms, or the T1s, say, and then send them out to the tax filers, where the tax filers would then have the option to make adjustments to their tax forms or not. And then the CRA would file the changed tax forms or the pre-populated tax forms if the tax filer chose not to change it. So the question is, can the CRA implement a system like this? And we think it can, and particularly, as Anna was saying, for our most vulnerable. So if we think about, so it can. There's a lot of third-party tax filing, third-party reporting going on, right? So the CRA collects information from employers on earned income via the T4s. And the CRA collects information on provincial social assistance income, so the T5007s, from the province's social assistance programs. So the CRA is collecting the information, and they do have the information already. So if we're thinking about, say, automatic tax filing for income assistance clients, this would be very beneficial because it would allow the income assistance clients to receive the benefits that they're not currently getting, such as the Canada Child Benefit or the GST HST credit. And because the income assistance clients are already on file with the provincial social assistance program, that program has their direct deposit information or the address that they're mailing checks to. So not only can the CRA pre-populate their tax forms, but they know where to send the benefits to if they're working with the provincial income assistance programs. There has been some work in this area. For instance, we do have a program called, the CRA has a program called File My Return, where for low-income persons that are invited, the CRA will pre-populate their tax forms, and then the tax filer has to call the CRA and answer a series of short questions, and their taxes will be done for them. This has had really low uptake. Very recently, Canada Digital Services and the CRA has been working on a new program that would be even easier to help low-income persons file their taxes, where instead of asking a series of questions, it looks like they would just essentially confirm the auto-populated form. However, it looks like the CRA has pulled the plug on this project for reasons I'm not I don't really know, but definitely automatic tax filing would help set up a basic income so that persons who don't file their taxes, who seem to be, vulnerable populations, would receive their benefits. Right. So I think that's
Thanks.
all from us.
Yeah.
So I think we can go on to if anyone has any questions now.
Yeah, thanks, Anna and Jillian. I'm opening up to Q&A. We've got a couple of questions already. For those of you who want to ask questions, haven't yet, please post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll pose your questions to Anna and Jillian. Okay, it's like a test. Question number one. How exactly do you see the definition of basic income working? Do you see it as a top-up of income that maybe is just insufficient to meet basic needs, or is it a lump sum that everyone would get, maybe depending on their circumstances?
That is a good question. There are so many basic income proposals out there. We've been thinking about basic income as more as a suite of programs or philosophy, instead of thinking about it about specific programs, because there's been so many programs. So we think about basic income more as a cash transfer program that's simple to access, simple to administer, simple to understand, that doesn't create stigma, that enhances social inclusion, and that enhances economic stability. So any program that kind of fits those parameters, whether it's called, a universal basic income or a guaranteed basic income, we think about as our general basic income programs.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that in saying that a basic income looks completely different depending on your policy goals, right? And so I would suggest that instead of working sort of policy idea down, you think about, okay, what are the issues that we're identifying? What are the problems? What are the gaps? What are the inequalities? What kind of change do we want to realize? And then choose the policy tool from there. And then that's where you start to build in the sort of considerations that Jillian's talking about. So yeah, it really depends. And yeah, depends on your goals.
Yeah, maybe just as a follow-up on that, excuse me, people are wondering, you mentioned that basic income's used to meet basic needs. Have you guys given any thought to what those basic needs are? What exactly are we trying to enable people to be able to provide for themselves?
Again, there is such a range of opinions here. I mean, it depends, like Anna was saying, it depends on your objective of a basic income. So if we're thinking about a basic income as a way to, reduce poverty, you might propose something where you have the level of basic income tied to the market basket measure of poverty or of income poverty that Statistics Canada puts out, because supposedly that's a measure of a basic standard of living in a region, right? But there's other objectives you can try to meet here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important also to consider basic income does, I guess, if you're thinking about it in the cash transfer way, get at the issue of income. But then there's all of these other policies and supports and services that also enable people to participate in a meaningful way in society. And so those also need to be weighed at the same time, and their interactions with the cash transfer as well. I don't know, it depends on sort of the capacity of government as well to respond to these things. If we're looking at austerity budgets, for example, what are we forgoing if we advocate for one policy? Are we putting other things that might be as important at risk? So it really depends.
Yeah, that was a nice lead into one of the questions we received, which is, you commented on it already, basically, that this is really going to be hard to maintain equity amongst people, $2,000 for me might mean something very different to someone else, depending on our circumstances. Another questioner asked, are we replacing all other support programs? That's what you just talked about with the basic income, or are we layering that on top of what we already have?
Yeah, I mean, subjectively, I would say absolutely we're not replacing it. But again, it depends. It depends on the model that you're looking at. I don't know, Jillian, if you want to speak a bit to the work that you've been doing in BC.
Right. So again, as many calls as there has been for basic income, there's a lot of different opinion on this. So some advocates would say that a basic income should replace essentially all income cash transfer programs, maybe not necessarily things like education and healthcare, which will still be needed. I would argue that a basic income can't replace all cash transfer programs, and it's because of this equity issue, right? So people with disabilities, they have generally higher costs of living. Say someone, and even within people with disabilities, there's a whole range of different costs of living. Say you have a person who needs a $5,000 wheelchair versus someone who needs a $50,000 wheelchair, right? Can we get rid of provincial programs that help supply these wheelchairs because we would prefer a basic income where everyone gets $2,000? It's not going to help the person who needs, a $50,000 wheelchair necessarily, right? It's just not enough money. Whereas it's going to be too much money for people that don't need $2,000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to maybe cast this in a bit of a different light, maybe a little outside, it's still related to the poverty reduction question, but from a bit of a different angle, and one focused maybe more on gender equality. There's a lot to be said about something like a basic income, particularly if calculated and paid to the individual, in giving women more autonomy, playing a key role in even freeing some of them potentially, or unbinding them from abusers, that sort of thing. But at the same time, we know that a variety of other things need to happen to achieve that sort of goal of gender equality beyond a financial transfer to support something like gender equality. So whether a basic income can address this feminization of poverty and correct for some of these gender inequalities, it's highly contested. Some think that it's going to give you freedom to live independently from men, freedom to rebalance your time and effort across activities of things like caregiving, employment, training, that sort of thing. But others suggest that gender equality really rests on the ability of systems to address the gender division of labor. And so that's a specialization in paid or productive labor, or productive work, for men, and unpaid or reproductive work for women. And that if we fail to actually challenge that bit, and we can fail to challenge that bit and still deliver a cash transfer, we're just going to perpetuate these inequalities, and the basic income could actually reinforce gender oppression and the fixed role of women as caregivers, and still limit their choice of going into the labor market. So it's actually quite nuanced in how it interacts with other programs. And so on top of the basic income, I would advocate for things like affordable or universal childcare as being just as important as that cash transfer. Sorry, that was a very long-winded way of saying.
I hesitate to ask this next question that somebody submitted because I know it's a difficult one. Have you given thought to if we can afford this as a society?
Right. So a basic income is expensive. I think I had some back of the envelope calculations, but if we did, sorry, one moment. If we did, say, a $2,000, basic income to everyone in Canada, we're looking at, 2,000, let's try this, times 30-ish million adults, we're looking at about someone might have to check my math on that, $6 billion, right? So a basic income, it's huge. I've looked at the simulations of a cost for a basic income in BC, and it would be a huge chunk of the BC budget if just BC alone was to do this. Basically, it would be much, much bigger than the BC income assistance program. So BC would have to either raise more revenue, which would be very difficult, post-pandemic to do, or they'd have to cut multiple programs to be able to afford it. It all comes down to trade-offs here.
Yeah.
We'd have to cut programs, or we'd have to raise revenue.
And I think we'd have to recognize the benefits as well. Just this is my own comment that we've seen from guaranteed annual income experiments done in the past that, in fact, there's large healthcare savings, et cetera. So we'd have to consider those as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questioners commented that for a long time, we've been talking about a negative income tax. And you've suggested one of the problems is that people don't file their taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So really, the questioner is wondering, is this just the solution? We do automatic filing and we rely on the tax system to deliver these benefits.
Well, I think that's part of that's why that was our main focus as an initial first step. Is I think, Jillian, what you've seen in a lot of your work is one of the key issues is this issue of access, not just in navigating the provincial systems, but in ensuring people actually get the benefits that they're entitled to. And if it were more automated, if it took the onus off of the individual, I think that would be a significant positive step, regardless of the actual policy that was being delivered.
One more question from a questioner, and he knows, I can see his name, so he'll know I'm just joking, but he's being a contrarian. So he's suggesting that the fact that we all have different needs, as heterogeneous needs, that's the appeal of a basic income rather than a drawback. That rather than try to means test programs because they're slow and they're inefficient and can be themselves unfair, it's just easier and maybe better that we simply give a basic income to everyone and it's the same amount.
Right. So I have an idea of why an example of why this would not work. So I think it was in 2017 when the Ontario Ford government came in, he tried to revamp spending for children with autism, right? So originally funding was going to regional service providers, and he wanted to change it to, we can think about it as a very, very limited basic income, but basically he was going to give $20,000 a year per child to all families who have children with autism. So the same amount of money, and it was going to be phased out after a certain income level, right? There's a huge outcry about this though, right? Because it was based on income and not need. So, autism is a spectrum, right? So there are some children for whom $20,000 a year was way too much. They were very low on the spectrum. They needed some interventions, but not much. But then there are other children who are very, very high on the spectrum and needed, things like applied behavior analysis, which cost way more than $20,000 a year. Sorry. So just giving everyone the same amount of money doesn't, take care of the issue of differing needs. Again, for, the children with autism that needed the applied behavior analysis, they could no longer afford it, right? We need to address things like that with a basic income.
One questioner asked, I think, a good question, that we provide support to people in need in many ways. You're emphasizing income support, but we also do it by supporting through services. And so I don't think you're wanting to get rid of the service part of the support, but we would have to meld these things together and recognize that as well. So it's just a comment more or less from the questioner that we still have these other services as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's a tough one. Do you think this is ever going to come to light, a basic income?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Or let me put it this way. Do you think the pandemic and the response we've made to it, do you think that's helped increase the possibility that we will introduce a basic income at some point?
So I think if anything, it's revealed the fact that many of us are in much more vulnerable position than maybe we thought. And it's also exposed, I think, more people to their vulnerability, and perhaps that experience, that firsthand experience, could have a role in sort of changing hearts and minds around our social safety net. And so I would say I don't know whether it's going to change impetus among governments, but I think the body politic might be more supportive, and that does drive what happens in our government sometimes, at least.
Right, but not necessarily. I couldn't say directly towards a basic income, but hopefully towards at least some type of reform of our entire income and social support system, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
it looks like we have a bit of a backlog of questions, so we're going to stay on for another few minutes to tackle a few more questions. For those of you who can't stick around, thank you for joining us. And if you check back to the school's website, you can see the recording as we finish up. So a couple more questions. Boy, there's so many. I'm scrolling through here. How do you think the basic income might impact charitable groups and nonprofits? They provide services to people in need too. Do you see them being impacted?
Right. So again, this would totally depend on the basic income that was implemented. And there's this, as I said before, as many basic income programs as there are people advocating for it. So if a basic income was to, replace not just cash transfers, but a lot of the basic services as well, that this might mean less government funding for NGOs and nonprofits. I think there will always be a role though for not-for-profits, because like I said, even if there was a basic income, it's not going to meet that heterogeneity of need. So there'll be a need for charities and for not-for-profits to still fill those needs.
Yeah, I think in a way it perhaps shifts the role of nonprofits, but just from personal experience, having worked in that sector and just speaking to colleagues, for example, who delivered financial empowerment, financial literacy training, often the concern was, well, I don't really need to teach budgeting to somebody who's already so resourceful. What they need is just a bit more money. I think with a basic income, if people actually have greater security, the role of the facilitator and the nonprofit goes from advocating for this participant to access just these sort of niggly benefits and to really empowering them to save more, do more, build their assets, that sort of thing. So not necessarily an elimination of the need for a charitable sector. It just shifts the role a little bit. Maybe enables them to do the work that they really want to do.
Maybe one last question. Do we need an experiment such as what got cut short in Ontario? Or have we learned enough? Or do we need another experiment to figure out exactly what the benefits or costs would be and what the optimal design would be?
My personal opinion is that we know enough. I don't know what yours is, Jillian. I think the cost of the pilot is just, if we're going that far, we might as well just implement the thing, but that's a personal.
I think speaking as an economist, there's things we can definitely learn from pilots, but there's a lot we can't learn from a pilot. So because, you know, in a pilot, generally it's a randomization. Some people get it, some people don't. We lose kind of, well, what's the community effect of a basic income, right? So in the Manitoba Basic Income Experiment in 1975, there was a saturation site where a whole community received the basic income. So a pilot like that could be more worthwhile. But then if you're doing it at a scale that big, again, the question is, well, maybe we should just move from a pilot to just doing the program.
Right, and just the sort of short-term, sorry, cat, does the fixed term of the pilot limit or change people's behavior in response to the basic income if they know that it's going to end? Would be a question that I would have.
Yeah, there's only so much you can learn from a pilot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so it looks like we're being attacked by the animals, so maybe we should stop there. I'm going to stop there by thanking Jillian and Anna for sharing your insights today, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. Please keep an eye in your inbox for a follow-up email and a link to future webinars.